Hello, I'm Megan Kelsman, and I am a policy researcher with the Carbon Leadership Forum. And today I'm going to dive into a little bit about embodied carbon and climate action plans. Quick overview of this presentation. We'll start with what are climate action plans? How is embodied carbon integrated into climate action plans? We'll talk a little bit about greenhouse gas inventories and baselines and go over a few different case studies of climate action plans, as well as touching on the development process and stakeholders. This is just session 2 of a 6-session policy introductory series with the Carbon Leadership Forum, and you can find more of this information on our website. So as far as matching policy opportunities with embodied carbon reduction strategies, there's many different ways we can go about doing this. While all 3 levels you see here, project, system, and procurement, they could be addressed at local or state government. Likely project level is highly context dependent, making it a better fit for local government. Just keeping that in mind. And on the project level, we can build less, reuse more. We can design to reduce embodied carbon and increase material structure efficiency. There's different tools we can use like calculators and design innovations as well. On the system level, we can choose low carbon systems and assemblies using alternate or low carbon materials or tools like whole building LCA. And on the procurement level, noting that not only government procurement, but this can be applied to the private sector. There's a clear distinction between procurement, between municipal projects and code incentive type mechanisms for private development. So just some ways we can optimize by selecting the lowest carbon version of selected procurement, promoting clean manufacturing like efficiency and fuel switching. And different tools for this include environmental product declarations or the REC3 tool. So effective policy packages can include a mix of different policy measures. And today you can see we're going to talk about climate action plans, which goes through the project, system, or procurement levels. And this is just a highlight where the focus of these policies typically is, but it's definitely not rigid. So just keeping that in mind. So what are climate action plans? There isn't one commonly understood definition of CAPs, but generally they are roadmaps that outline specific activities that an agency will undertake to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So why should we include embodied carbon in CAPs? Well, one, we can create alignment around regionally relevant goals and strategies. We can encourage complementary policy development, encourage regional collaboration, and highlight municipal or lead by example policies and opportunities. Here's a few examples of North American CAP precedents that do include embodied carbon. You can see there's about 14 city or regional CAPs listed here on this map and 3 C40 Clean Construction Declaration Action Plans, which I'll discuss more in a minute, that already exist in North America. So we'll be going into a few different of these cities and counties as case studies later in the presentation. So how is embodied carbon integrated into climate action plans? Well, every climate action plan is different, but embodied carbon typically falls into the following areas such as buildings, waste and material recovery, local production or industry, and consumption emissions. Setting goals related to buildings and materials or consumption can help ensure that transportation, construction materials are included, for example, like concrete, asphalt, etc. And this chart here on the right shows you different areas or sections of the CAP where embodied carbon is included. It's not the same for everyone, but you can see Austin, King County, LA, Phoenix include embodied carbon in the building section of their CAP. San Francisco and Eugene, on the other hand, have it in the consumption section. So this just goes to show it differs by each CAP. And here is a list of different embodied carbon strategies that are identified by CAPs that incorporate embodied carbon goals and targets. So here you can see specific strategies around buildings is really common at municipal buildings. So like I mentioned, leading by example, base codes, building incentives and regulations, sometimes voluntary reporting. There can be strategies around material recovery and reuse, such as supporting local reuse markets, deconstruction requirements, waste diversion requirements, etc. And additionally, there can be strategies around low carbon materials like public procurement, supporting low carbon material producers who are local, grants for new manufacturing technologies that are dramatically reducing process emissions. And yeah, so there's different options for strategies in the different caps. These strategies can fall under a combination of educational and outreach programs like tools, training, events, knowledge sharing, incentive programs such as financial incentives, density bonuses, tax incentives, etc., or even expedited permitting and policy alignment targets. So targets are a key component of any climate action plan strategy, and embodied carbon is no exception. You can see in this chart that some of the different targets that different cities and counties set. You can see Austin, 40% reduction by 2030 from a 2020 baseline, Los Angeles, 50% by 2030. So there's different ones, and sometimes they do not include an overall target. But there is also overall targets set by organizations such as C40 cities, you can see here on the left, like the Clean Construction Declaration, which sets targets for buildings and infrastructure, and Architecture 2030 sets embodied carbon targets as well. And just noting in the future, we may be able to also reference embodied carbon disclosure project and scope 3 science-based targets. So greenhouse gas inventories and baselines. We think it's really important to include this because most cities base their sphere of concern on what they're measuring. So only manage what you measure. And their current standard protocols do not include embodied carbon. So sometimes embodied carbon can be in government's blind spot. There's two primary types of inventories: production-based, also known as territorial or sector-based, and consumption-based inventories. The key difference between these types of inventories is whether you're counting up emissions that are produced within a regional boundary versus consumed within your regional boundary. Of course, there's some overlap between these approaches. They're not rigid. They can be used together. For example, if a coal power plant in Missouri produces electricity that is then used in St. Louis, those emissions would show up either way. However, let's say that St. Louis were using electricity from a coal power plant across the border in Illinois. In that case, those emissions would only be accounted using a consumption-based approach. So many production-based inventories have started to use a consumption-based approach for electricity for this reason. However, it's still relatively rare to do a holistic consumption-based inventory that also includes goods and materials consumed within a city or state. So this essentially means what we think of as embodied carbon is not completely excluded from most inventories, aside from locally produced materials or produced materials within the city or county. So production-based inventories uses a methodology that's fairly standardized. Consumption-based, on the other hand, is not yet standardized. However, the US EPA has published a state approach. And yeah, so this means that emissions reduction goals are completely excluding emissions from things like food, steel, or cement if it's produced across borders. This out of sight, out of mind approach is particularly dangerous when it results in outsourcing of emissions rather than actual reductions. So why does it matter and when should we use them? A consumption-based inventory is not a substitute for a territorial greenhouse gas inventory or production-based inventory. Rather, they can both be used together. Many local governments are already collecting data on emissions inside their city boundaries. However, they are often excluding upstream and downstream life cycle stages, which can unintentionally incentivize emissions outsourcing. A consumption-based inventory is most useful for understanding where the embedded emissions generated outside the city boundaries constitute a significant portion of the carbon footprint of the household and government consumption. And this is including most life cycle stages. And as well, a consumption-based inventory can lead to insights about where local consumption gives rise to emissions outside a city's borders. and we can suggest additional opportunities for reducing emissions. So therefore, leading to development of policies informed by upstream and downstream emissions impacts. So here's an example. On the left, you can see production-based and right is consumption-based. This one on the left was a 2018 study from Washington. And this shows the totals from transportation, electricity, heating, etc. You can see transportation is 44%, so almost half of the emissions from the state of Washington. And consumption-based on the right side, this right-hand chart is comparing Oregon with other US and foreign areas. So vehicles, parts, food, appliances, services are actually a large portion where transportation on the production example is the largest, almost half of the emissions. So even so, doing this consumption-based inventory, there can be blind spots. Still hidden is non-residential construction in embodied carbon. And in some consumption-based, it's called out upstream in commercial services and goods consumed by households, but it's usually buried. And just a quick note, there's work happening in Europe on a protocol to estimate total embodied carbon of a jurisdiction's built environment. But even without that granularity, consumption-based highlights the existence and magnitude of scope 3 embodied emissions, which is often enough to get an embodied carbon policy added to the list. So you saw Oregon on the last slide, and this is just going into Oregon as well, which included a sector and consumption-based greenhouse gas inventory. And you can see here Oregon's sector-based inventory, or the production-based, is the blue dotted line. It's shown mostly declining emissions since 2007, while its consumption-based inventory, or the red dashed line, has continued to climb since 1999. So this has really motivated Oregon's policymakers to consider policies that address the full life cycle of emissions. It's really clear here, rather than only those within Oregon's boundaries. And in the context of corporate policy and government policy, so not only corporate, but also government, and greenhouse gas emissions reporting, you may have heard about these same issues in the context of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Companies can use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Corporate Accounting and Reporting Standard to track their emissions and therefore progress towards their emissions reduction goals. If you see a company that's reported net zero goal, make sure you understand which scope is included in that. So here, this chart on the left, scope 1, you can see its emissions from a company's or government's operations that are under a facility's direct control, so on-site fuel combustion, for example. However, scope 2 emissions are from usage of electricity, steam, heat, cooling, purchased from third parties. And scope 3 emissions are the upstream and downstream value chain emissions, including transportation emissions, business travel, downstream emissions from transportation, usage of sold products, product disposal. So really note the connection between scope 3 or supply chain and greenhouse gas accounting for government agencies and embodied carbon emissions. Many GHG inventories for agencies that include scope 3 emissions show high embodied carbon impacts. When scope 1, 2, and 3 are examined at an agency or an organizational level, the purchasing emissions are usually greater than 50% of emissions, which puts more focus on actions to actually reduce these emissions. So, as I mentioned earlier, there's a variety of cities and counties who have published climate action plans. And today I'll be going into just a few of them in more detail. One example is the Austin Climate Equity Plan from 2020 to 2021. They set a target that by 2030, the goal is to reduce embodied carbon footprint of building materials used in local construction by 40% from a 2020 baseline. So how are they going to do that? They have different strategies. Some fall under the municipal buildings, so creating design and construction specifications and purchasing agreements for city-owned projects. They have incentives to integrate lower carbon building materials and deconstruction practices into the city incentives programs, like expedited permitting, green building program, educational programs, creating a performance framework and educational programming for industry professionals, as well as the general public. And support for local producers. So encouraging growth of local businesses, prioritizing partnerships with local materials markets, etc. The San Francisco Climate Action Plan in 2021, they set a target to achieve total carbon balance across the buildings and infrastructure sectors. And by 2030, buildings constructed will have a 40% reduction in embodied carbon. Some of their strategies include policy instruments like developing incentives, policies, guidelines for adaptive reuse of existing buildings, as well as a design and procurement of low carbon structural materials for new construction, amending existing policies to require deconstruction of buildings, incentives like cultivating regional building material reuse markets, supporting workforce development, small business enterprises, and innovation. And they also have an educational strategy as well for advancing best practices for design for disassembly and buildings as material banks. So looking next at King County, they have a 2021 climate action plan. This is the Seattle area. This is an example of one that has incorporated GHG emissions reductions related to embodied carbon and procurement, rather than only operational carbon. And it specifically cites the EC3 tool as an action to achieve reductions. However, they don't set an overall target. Some of the reduction strategies are base construction codes, introducing building codes requirements that lower embodied carbon in certain building materials. They specify low carbon building materials in King County capital projects, starting with concrete and expanding to other materials in the future. Supporting local producers, dedicating resources to increase reuse of wood products in construction, for example, and also providing financial and technical incentives and support to bridge the gap between code minimum buildings and high performance buildings with lower embodied carbon materials. So that was just a few case studies. There's a lot more information out there, and we encourage you to look into these. And just really quickly, development process and stakeholders for climate action plans. We started seeing CAPs adopted in the early 2000s, and they are updated around every 5 years. The municipalities of cities and counties, institutions, organizations are usually the ones creating these, definitely including a variety of stakeholders like residents, businesses, elected officials, design and construction communities, etc., all providing input. And it's an iterative process. Really, you can set preliminary goals and targets, but as you go on, evaluating measures and strategies, calculating financial impact is sometimes included. There's usually a public comment process and revising goals based on feedback from all of the different stakeholders included. So just a few takeaways. Climate action plans are roadmaps that outline specific activities that an agency or government will undertake to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We talked about the difference between production versus consumption-based greenhouse gas inventories. And we want to create alignment around regionally relevant goals and strategies. The CAPs can encourage complementary policy development, encourage regional collaboration. And we highlighted just a few municipal lead by example policies today, different opportunities they use, different strategies to achieve carbon reductions. So with that, thank you so much.